Here on Flow FM, one of our regulars during 2022 has been South Australian Liberal Senator Alex Antic. He's back again in 2023. Alex, how was your break?
It was really good, thanks, Ricky. Not long enough as usual, but we're back and we're ready to keep swinging.
Well, politics never sleeps, does it either? And some of these international organisations never sleep as well. You've got your eye on the World Health Organisation. What is it?
Yeah, look, well, the World Health Organisation, probably be familiar to most people. It's a global body which is effectively a joining together of countries for, health-related discussions. And the original concept, I think, was to try and get a roundtable discussion for, countries to talk about things that might happen on a global scale. So it lends itself perfectly to a pandemic, but it also lends itself perfectly to attempting to try and grab more power than we should in these sort of circumstances as well. And there's growing criticism of the role the WHO had during COVID. I mean, many of the listeners will remember some of the early statements that were made that were just completely wrong. And indeed, some of the, the narrative about COVID, which was ultimately shown to be wrong as well. So there's a bit of criticism around the body itself, and I think we're seeing now the creeping tentacles of them trying to push into grabbing more power over the next period, which is something that I know a lot of people are concerned about. Probably not enough, but I certainly am.
Well, one of the intersections of topics that you also like to talk about is the Chinese Communist Party. One area where the World Health Organization was prominent early during the pandemic was the Wuhan and the investigative team that tried to get in there, and they seem to lack the power to actually force China to open up and get to the bottom of what happened there. Do you think that's why they're reaching for more power?
Yeah, it's hard to know, but people may or may not have remembered, I think late last year or towards the end of last year, there was a push from the United States, who's of course a signatory body to the WHO, to try and amend the international health regulations, which are this sort of global legal set of rules under international law, which guides the manner in which people or the World Health Organization takes on pandemics and other sorts of things as well. That failed, actually. It ended up failing because a number of the African nations, not the Western European and the liberal democracies of the world, voted against it, but the African nations actually pushed back and shot them down. And the amendments were things like, asking for more power during a pandemic, more ability to coerce people into having medical treatment, and all those sorts of things, which on one level sound okay, and on a whole different level, when you really think about them, they are really not okay. We're now seeing the rebirth of that, and that push for amendments to the international health regulations and what's called a pandemic treaty are really, really worrying as far as I'm concerned. We're not talking about them enough. Certainly the mainstream media in this country are not talking them enough, and that's why it's great that Flow FM is willing to talk about it. It's fantastic.
Well, when it comes to treaties and powers that they're talking about at the World Health Organisation level, don't they only have effect in Australia if our Parliament actually gives effect to them? Or as a lawyer yourself, is there, I know the treaties became the basis upon which, say, the Tasmanian Dams case got up with the Greens.
That's right.
Is that what you're getting at here?
Yeah, and I mean there are. And look, I mean some of the legislation that's already in effect, I imagine would follow. Would require this country to follow what the international health regulations say. But you're right. In terms of treaty obligations, it's complicated, and I'm no international lawyer, never was. But effectively, what they do is provide the vehicle for countries to then legislate on their own. So you're absolutely right. In fact, when we were talking about the COVID Discrimination Act, the power that it was hooked to was the external affairs power under the Constitution, and the rationale for doing that was a treaty, treaty obligations about human rights and those sorts of things. So, yeah, there is a bit of a trickle-down effect, but it's very powerful in its own right. And, of course, in order to get these things done, the best thing you can do is make the so-called authorities, the so-called experts, have a position on it. And then it's easier for local bureaucracies to say, well, we're just adopting the international position, and therefore we should do that here as well. So there's a multitude of trickle-down effects as to how this will ultimately impact local health. It's very, very big. It's a big document, quite complicated, these international health regulations amendments. But basically what they're going to do is create another billion-dollar bureaucracy, global bureaucracy. They're going to extend its powers. And really, there's going to be the ability for overseas organisations and bureaucrats to tell Australians what to do with their own healthcare. So it's an issue of sovereignty, and I always say it's a question of whether or not We believe in national sovereignty or globalism.
Yeah, on that topic of, I guess, them telling us what to do in a legal sense, there's also the digital side of it in terms of tracking people's movements. We know in the communist China, they've got the mechanisms to even restrict people's movements based on their vaccination status. You've experienced a bit of that yourself in South Australia. Is the World Health Organization going down the path of electronically wanting to monitor people's movements in that way?
There's a global push which has sort of been creeping in for a little while, but it seems to be getting a whole lot more traction now. And the example you use in China is exactly right. They have a system over there where there are millions of cameras which are now using facial recognition technology, and the number one app in China, which is called WeChat, which is used for almost everything, people talking, people paying their bills, and the interconnection of all of those is really worrying, because ultimately what they're doing in China is giving people a social credit score. And if you're seen jaywalking or, you're seen at a protest, your social credit score goes down, and then you don't get access to some of these services. So I'm very worried that we're drifting into the same model. COVID saw the beginnings of that. We had people QR code checking in, the very beginnings of being tracked. And indeed, even in South Australia, we had the home quarantine app, which was a piece of software that went on your phone, that took your facial data and your GPS data and cross-referenced it, sent it back to police headquarters so that the police knew where you were at all times due to COVID restrictions. Now, you wouldn't get that sort of treatment if you were on home detention for an accused crime. I think we're seeing that creep in here, and the absolute key to all of this is the digital identity, which is a piece of legislation that's out there brewing around. It was in the last Parliament. I think it was even introduced, which is going to give Australians a unique digital identity, and the rationale is it's just going to collate all of the government data, but where does it go, and does it become mandatory? The combination of all of those things, plus a digital currency, means we can be controlled like never before in the coming years. We're not talking about it enough. I remember when I was a kid, people talked about the Australia card and all these sorts of things, and there seemed to be more awareness of it out in the community. What we have to do is start talking about these things out in the broad wide world so that people know the world which they're signing up for.
Yeah, you mentioned the Australia card. I was thinking that as you were talking there. I remember that debate, and that was comprehensively rejected by the public. But have we been conditioned through, say, the last few years of pandemic-related powers to people being used to being traced and shrugging the shoulders and going, I'm okay with the government knowing everything I do?
I hear it more and more than I ever thought I would. People have said things to me, including but not limited to, I'm very flattered if the government wants to know what I'm doing. I like the security of having surveillance cameras everywhere and things to that effect. I'm surprised. I think we have seen a softening of the community through COVID, and I think it has had that effect, whether it was intended that way or not. You get a range of views, but whatever the purpose is, we are all now, I think, 2 years down the track, 2.5 years down the track, much more agreeable to giving away our freedom. And I don't like that at all. I don't think that's a very good thing. I don't think it's something we should covet. And, where does it go from here? We've got to be really vigilant about this because, I've heard it said that once the digital ID is out of the cage, we're in real trouble.
Well, Senator Alex Antic, I myself enjoy the occasional drive down a dirt road. I think sometimes we've got to go off the beaten track with you to find these things that are for good reason being hidden from the public eye. Glad that you're picking up on it, and we'll keep chatting about these things during 2023.
We've got a lot to do. Thanks again and Happy New Year.